This is my 2024 Kawasaki Ninja H2. I bought this bike a little over a month ago, and I'm going to turn this off before I kill the battery. Since then, I've made a video about a critical issue about this motorcycle. Now, in this video, I talked about how this bike from the factory is a supercharged motorcycle that does not have an intercooler. And the problem with that is that when you rip on this bike for an extended period of time, like holding the throttle down for long periods of time without giving the bike a break, it can cause the supercharger on this bike to get extremely hot and potentially cause damage. So I kind of have this like running joke on the internet that like, oh, I'm not a real rider, just like trailer my bike places, but which is fine, it's funny. I don't care about that, people can say whatever they want. But what I do have a problem with is when I say a factual statement on the internet, basically a bike review, and someone is straight up calling me a liar. So I'm going to try to explain this as simply as possible so that way people can understand exactly what I'm complaining about on this bike, so that way there's absolutely no confusion about my complaints about this lovely motorcycle. None of these things are bad enough for me to make me want to sell this bike. Let me just make that clear. This is an awesome motorcycle. I do love it with, this is a pretty good bike. I think that there's a reason that these things are held in very high regard, and people should love them, but there's an issue that I didn't know about before I bought this bike, and I kind of wish someone else told me, so we're going to talk about that. So, I'm sorry to pick on someone, but we're going to pick on the loudest guy. This is Mr. Broke. Mr. Broke is a guy with no name, no face, surprisingly. His page is mainly about the fact that he owns one of these bikes, the Kawasaki Ninja H2. So Mr. Broke has had some issues with the things I've been posting about this bike. After I made the video, I guess he has some people in his comments saying like, oh, you don't actually want an H2 because it overheats. I never asked people to comment that. Those are just people who took my video and had impressions of that, whatever. Mr. Broke didn't take very kindly to this and posted a few videos with my name in a caption, basically calling me out. Didn't directly at me or anything, whatever. So I just want to clear up any misunderstanding with that. Once again, my issue with this bike, first of all, it's stock. This is a completely stock bike. It's running a stock tune, stock exhaust. This is the full, cold, hard, honest truth. When I am ripping on this bike in any degree of temperature, I've actually gone and tested in 50-degree weather. It still does this. Like truly ripping on this bike, whether you want to believe me or not, but I'm saying like holding the throttle for minutes at a time. Supercharger, not the coolant on the bike, the supercharger. There's two coolant gauges. Actually, yeah, let me just show you real quick. Probably be easier than trying to describe it. There are two coolant gauges. There is a coolant gauge here, and if you press up on the trip odometer, you can find the boost temperature, which I don't know if the lighting is going to allow you to see, but see how there are two separate temperature readings. So my issue is when you are ripping on the bike, the coolant temperature goes down, but the boost temperature rises rapidly. Anything above around 140, 150 miles an hour, if you're holding for an extended period of time, that boost temperature just goes up and up and up, and in warmer degrees, that can be catastrophic. Now I gotta wait for it to cool down. What the f, bro? Come on. Is it 190 right now? Like, come on. You gotta wait forever for it to cool, too. So I got to 209 there, I believe. And this is a very cold, very chilly night, by the way. It's about like 60 degrees out, maybe 55 in some areas. Yeah, it's about 55 degrees outside right now. It's pretty chilly. I got my leather gloves on, and I'm still cold. And yet this thing still, after just a quick pull, hit 209 degrees. That's pretty warm and toasty. Now, I've personally never had the bike over 225 degrees. I've had to let off the throttle and let it cool down. You just ride like normal, and that boost temperature should come down. However, I've been told by many motorcycle mechanics that anything over 250 degrees can lead to permanent damage. It's not going to blow the motor immediately, but for long-term reliability, that is very bad for the motor. And I have no doubt, a little bit more of a enthusiastic throttle hand, you can definitely get to that temperature. And again, this is on a stock H2. Mr. Burke responded by posting a bunch of little pulls here and there, and I was like, hold on, that's not what I said in my video. Holding the throttle down for an extended period of time. Little pull here and there, that's totally fine, but my issue is you do a pull, you pass something that isn't happy that you're doing a pull, and then all of a sudden you have to be buried in it, and you don't want to have to be buried in it. It's a bad idea if the bike's gonna start to overheat. So I called him on it, and I was like, that's not what I was talking about. You have to be pinning it. And so he posts one of his friends, Lightspeed H2, who actually does ride the bike the way it wants to be ridden. However, Mr. Lightspeed H2 has an intercooler on his H2. Now, an intercooler, what is that? Allow me to explain the physics of a supercharger while also trying to explain what an intercooler is and why this bike needs it. So the way boosted vehicles work is it basically increases the efficiency of a motor. It has a compressor, either a supercharger or a turbocharger. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the differences of those, but basically they compress air. There's a little turbine in there that spins super fast, compresses air, which makes it more energy dense. That compressed air is sent through the airbox into the motor, which makes a bigger boom and more horsepower. That's why this bike is known for going as fast as it does. It's because it's one of the only boosted bikes from the factory on the market. That's why it's so legendary. So what that turbine is doing is, yes, it's compressing the air, but it's also superheating that air. So that's why your boost temperatures rise so rapidly when getting on the throttle on this bike. So that superheated air is sent through the airbox into the motor, and if that air is hitting 250 degrees, hitting that aluminum block, you're going to cause warping, and it's just very bad for the motor. How do you prevent that? Well, glad you asked. I actually have another boosted vehicle right here to explain that for you. This is my 2018 Honda Civic Si. What a lovely thing that is, huh? This thing has a turbocharger from the factory. The difference between this car and this bike is that this bike is built to go as fast as possible, while this car, I would hope Honda built this to last as many miles as possible. History of reliability, I would imagine that they would try to keep that. So the major difference, and I don't know if you can quite see this here, there's a giant radiator here that most cars have. Well, pretty much every car in existence has a radiator that cools the engine. It dissipates heat more efficiently than the motor could do itself. Coolant is sent through the radiator, which goes through the fin. Air goes through the fins, cools the coolant, and then the coolant goes back into the car, or the motor, or whatever. Down here is an intercooler. What the intercooler does is that turbocharger inside this car superheats and compresses the air, and then that superheated compressed air is sent through the intercooler just like coolant, goes through pipes, gets cooled down by the air entering through the fins, and is sent into the airbox into the motor and makes a bigger boom. The benefit to that cooled air, it is more reliable and produces more horsepower than superheated compressed air. That is what this bike is missing. Now, this bike from the factory only has a radiator for the coolant. It does not have an intercooler. So all the supercharger is doing is superheating, super compressing the air, and then sending it straight into the motor. All that superheated compressed air is going straight into the motor, which can be catastrophic in some cases if you are getting this bike to the extremes. What surprised me is Lightspeed H2 also made a post about me, which allowed me to read this conversation. So he added me in his story, and I replied, but you got the intercooler, right? So on Lightspeed H2's bike, you can clearly see a separation between the black radiator that comes stock on these bikes and a silver intercooler. Now, I know you can buy these intercoolers for around $4,000, and that's exactly what they look like. It is layered on top of the radiator on these bikes. That way you can send the superheated air through the intercooler back to the bike. Seeing that intercooler is a really easy way to know if someone actually rides this bike the way it's meant to be ridden, or they don't. So if you guys ever see an H2 out in public and you don't see that little silver thing there, they probably don't ride their bike to the limit. So he asks me on his story, and I respond, but you got the intercooler though, right? Which I know he did, because I went on his profile and saw that his bike has an intercooler. I knew that he has an intercooler, and you wouldn't just get an intercooler for no reason, right? And then he responds, the bike runs hot, yes, like I said, but it's never overheated on me during its 12K miles stock. Again, I never said this bike would overheat and die. I simply said that sending that level of superheated air into the motor is not good for it long term. He then follows up with, I got the intercooler because I thought it was cool, and at least offered minor benefit. You're not going to spend $4,000 because you thought it looked cool, because nobody knows. No one's going to know. It's tucked under there. You got to look for it. So I called him out on it. I said, because it was cool, be for real, bro. I knew this guy got an intercooler for a reason. You don't just buy it because it's cool. This man is sitting here telling me he bought a $4,000 intercooler kit, but you don't actually need a $4,000 intercooler kit. Yeah, just losing me at this point. He said, I mean, the engineering principle, albeit basic, is pretty cool. Why wouldn't I take the temp drops when I can? On any bike, not just the H2s. None of this is a big deal, so it is what it is, man. Hope you enjoy the bike. And he goes on to talk about how Ducatis and Aprilia run hotter, whatever. So I also have a Ducati Panigale V4. Lightspeed H2 talks about how that bike also runs hot. The difference between this bike and the Ducati V4 is the Ducati V4 properly sheds heat the faster you go on it, the way that these bikes want to be ridden. They want to be ridden fast. That's what they're designed to do, or most of them are designed to do. So when the Ducati V4 starts going fast, yeah, you get more heat around your sides, your legs, and your groin, but that is just the bike doing its job and shedding the heat from the motor onto the open air, which just happens to be where you're sitting. The bike itself is not running hot. It's just shedding the heat, so you think it's hotter than what it actually is. This bike, when you're sitting on it, does not feel hot. And what it's doing is sending that superheated air into the motor the faster you go. Now, like Lightspeed said, it's not a big deal. You can just buy an intercooler kit. If you can afford this bike, you can afford an intercooler kit. No big deal. I am just trying to tell people what this bike is like stock. And which brings me to my final point is I don't get why these people are lying about this. We were talking about someone who straight up spent $4,000 on an intercooler kit and says that you don't need a $4,000 intercooler kit. He said he bought it because he thought it was cool. It just makes no sense to me. And so I'm left wondering why these guys are saying this. Because I know Kawasaki's not going to sponsor these guys. And what I think it is it's just ego talking. When you buy this bike, it is one of the most expensive sport bikes on the market. It's the coolest thing. You know, they're hard to get. You have to special order them if you want to buy one. You can't just walk into a dealership and buy one. These are hard to get. And so what I think people like doing is they want to feel special. And when you start talking trash about something that they find very special and holds up their self-image, they get a little defensive with it, to the point where they're just straight up denying physics. I have the benefit of owning a lot of different motorcycles. I've also ridden a lot of motorcycles, but being able to own this bike and know everything about it and being able to talk honestly about it is a privilege. And this is something I watch a lot of YouTube, and this is just something I never saw people talking about. So I'm just trying to share it with the world and let people know, before we buy a Kawasaki H2, please understand, if you want to ride this bike the way it truly wants to be ridden, and I'm sure how you guys want to ride it, you have to buy an intercooler. Or you can get a used one that already has one on it. Otherwise, this is just another city putter that is really janky and hard to ride. And one last thing I want to talk about is I just want to talk to the guys I was talking about in this video. I remember when I bought my Kawasaki 636 back in the day. It was my first fully faired sport bike. And the thing that got to my head was that bike had an extra 37 cc's over any of the competition. I thought it had to be the fastest thing out there. It had to be the fastest 600. And so I went out trying to race anybody I could find. And when I raced my friend who had a 2020 Yamaha R6, and he started pulling on me in the top end, I remember feeling just like, how could I be let down? But I was so disappointed. I had such an image in my head of what that bike should be and how much I loved it. I couldn't bear to see the fact that it lost. And it's the same thing with this bike. I'd personally dreamed of owning this bike. I wouldn't have ever dreamed of having a problem with the way it runs stock, but that's just what it is. And with that being said, I do plan on putting an intercooler on it, and then you won't ever hear me complain about this bike ever again. It's just that it's the middle of summer for me. I would rather spend that time riding this bike to at least the point where I feel comfortable riding it. I mean, it's not pushing it so far that I feel like I'm doing damage to it, but just enough where I can feel like I can enjoy it. And then over the winter, when it's unrideable here, I can let this bike sit in the shop on it. No big deal. But until then, yes, the H2 runs hot. Will it kill the bike? Probably not. Will it cause damage? Maybe. I guess time will tell. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.